So our second snippet for this week looks at what I think are the two other big issues in constitutional history during the 20s. The first are the activities of the Supreme Court, kind of pro-business vision of the court, and the second is an intra-branch battle over control of foreign policy between president and the executive. So this is a photograph of the Taft Court. Here's William Howard Taft, former president of the United States, the only president to subsequently serve on the Supreme Court. And in many ways, Taft saw the Chief Justice position of the Supreme Court as more significant than the presidency. He's Chief Justice from 1921 through 1930. He commands a quite reliable conservative majority. And there are a number of decisions that strike down state or federal legislation whose goal, at least whose stated goal, was to enact pro-worker or pro-consumer legislation. So a handful of these decisions, this case called Bailey versus Drexel Furniture, it dealt with a federal law imposing a significant tax on goods or services that were produced through child labor, which at this point was legal in American history. There was a concern that a number of states, especially in the South, were kind of undercutting the market by letting young kids, 10, 11, 12 years old, work in factories. So Congress passed a law saying that any good produced by child labor would be taxed at a heavy margin, and that presumably would remove the incentive for manufacturers to use child labor. The court strikes this down, saying that it is an unconstitutional tax, that it amounts not to a tax. The goal is not here to raise revenue, but instead to impose a penalty on this group of businesses for how they do their businesses. In 1923, in a case called Adkins versus Children's Hospital, the Taft Court strikes down a federal minimum wage law, which was applied only to women. And so this was an outgrowth. Remember, we looked a couple snippets ago at this Mueller case, Mueller versus Oregon, where the Supreme Court, largely for sexist reasons, had said that laws that limited the work week of women were constitutional, even though laws that created a generalized work week, as in Lochner, were unconstitutional. So the idea behind Adkins was you get a federal minimum wage law for women. Manufacturers, businesses would find it too inconvenient to have two separate wage systems. So you get a kind of a minimum wage law for everyone as a result. Court strikes this down as well. You can see the reasons here in red. Basically, this is applying the principles of Lochner. Again, this freedom of contract idea that if you have a minimum wage, let's say it's $1 an hour, that prevents those who want to work for 90 seconds an hour from negotiating their own pay. And then this case called Bluefield Waterworks versus the Public Service Commission. One of the big things in the progressive era was to create new bodies dealing with public utilities that would regulate and provide rates under which power companies, water companies, they could make a small profit, but they couldn't gouge consumers. And progressives had high hopes for these commissions, which in almost every state are still around. Not quite the pro-consumer paradise that they were envisioned at the time. But in Bluefield Waterworks, the court takes a very skeptical eye towards these regulatory actions, arguing that they infringe on the contractual rights, the rights to a profit of these utilities. So the pattern here is an easy one to detect, which is that when there's a contest between business interests on the one hand and legislation designed to protect workers or consumers on the other, the Taft Court finds a way to side with business. There, in part, the Taft Court does this because there really isn't a ton of political resistance to this vision during the 1920s. The Democratic Party moves quite a ways to the right in the 20s. They nominate a very conservative candidate in 1924, a man named John W. Davis, and the only left-wing candidate in the 1924 election is actually Robert La Follette, the former and then at this point current Wisconsin senator who is not in great health. He dies in 1925, but in 1924 he runs as a third-party progressive candidate. And he carries all of the counties that are in green on this map. He wins almost 20% of the vote nationally, which is particularly impressive given that he's basically, shut out entirely in the South. He carries, however, only one state, Wisconsin. He finishes second in a number of states in the upper Midwest and in the Rockies. And in a lot of ways, the La Follette 24 bid shows the limits of a reformist campaign, at least as a third-party effort. La Follette and a group of senators around him called the Peace Progressives, most of them Republicans, but again, this is a period where the upper Midwest tended to be a one-party area, and so in the Republican primary, it would be a battle between the left and the right. La Follette was one of a number of these peace progressive senators who expressed concerns that U.S. intervention, especially in the Caribbean basin, was imperialistic, was contrary to American constitutional principles, and was subverting American ideals by protecting American commercial and business interests at the expense of the national good. And under President Coolidge, who takes office when Harding dies in 1923, the U.S. is quite active in the regions. It sends troops or threatens to send troops to Mexico. It continues to occupy Haiti. It periodically threatens to intervene in Cuba. It formally pulls troops out of Nicaragua, but out of the Dominican Republic, but after a treaty that almost makes the Dominican Republic a protectorate. And then most significantly, the U.S. intervenes in a civil war in Nicaragua during the 1920s. The two major parties in Nicaragua were called liberals and conservatives. There really wasn't much of a difference between the two. But when the U.S. intervenes on the side of the conservatives, there's more of a nationalistic revolution that takes place. Headed by a former liberal general named Augusto Sandino. And Sandino exposes the United States to guerrilla warfare, the kind of thing that the U.S. will face in the war in Vietnam. He's quite popular in Nicaragua, and the U.S. keeps sending more and more troops to Nicaragua. There were around 5,000 U.S. troops there by the late 1920s, even though Congress had never declared war against Nicaragua. On the right is Sandino. On the left is Henry Stimson, who was appointed a former cabinet official in the Roosevelt and Taft administrations, later in the FDR administration as well, who was appointed by President Coolidge to travel down to Nicaragua and try to mediate an end to the civil war that will marginalize Sandino's power. The U.S. initially intervened on behalf of the Conservative Party, but as Sandino gets more popular, the fear is to persuade the liberals and the conservatives to work together to sort of marginalize Sandino. This is a photograph of U.S. troops in Nicaragua in the 1920s. The left wing of the Senate is very concerned about this for a couple of reasons. First, they generally sympathize with Sandino in this effort. Secondly, they make the correct argument to Coolidge. Look, you're sending U.S. troops into a war zone. You haven't requested Congress, and Coolidge's response to them is basically tough luck. Make me do something about it. And Congress in 1928 and 1929 ultimately does so. The Senate passes an amendment sponsored by this man, C.C. Dill, who was a Democratic senator from Washington State who worked with affiliated with the Peace Progressives on foreign policy issues, which cut off funds for the U.S. military intervention in Nicaragua. Administration backers in the Senate used a procedural gambit to get the Dill Amendment pushed aside, but the message that the passage of the amendment communicated was that the United States was simply not going to, that the Senate was not going to tolerate much more of a sustained intervention, and the U.S. largely pulls out. This debate over, undeclared war and whether Congress can use the power of the purse, cut off funds to force the executive to end an undeclared war. This is a theme that we will come back to when we look at the Vietnam War in the 60s. So that's our second snippet for this week.